we come apart, we ask the Holy Spirit to guide us in our thoughts, to give us wisdom, to give us light, to give us a word. In that spirit, we can begin our time apart with Samuel in the first book of Samuel, chapter 3. The story is well known, but we can revisit it and place ourselves way back there in pre-Christian times, in the unchanging sound of silence. So we have here, at the beginning of chapter 3, the boy Samuel has been given to the Lord. He's serving him in the presence of Eli. And then we have this moment in which the Lord comes. One day it happened that Eli was lying down in his room. His eyes were beginning to grow dim. He could no longer see. The lamp of God had not yet gone out. And as we come into a place of perpetual adoration, that lamp of God is actually something which speaks loudly in this place. And it collocates us also in the ambit of what was very popular in certain countries, England for instance, before the generalization of convent life as we know it, the system of reclusion, when a lady would give herself to the Lord in that absolute form of being a living lamp. The old medieval churches would have quite often a reclusory, and the classic example would be our own Julian of Norwich, whose cell they have actually rebuilt as it was, and it is there looking on to the altar, and they would have one window open on the tabernacle and then one window veiled with a black cross where people could actually hear the voice of the recluse. But the other was something which in a sense is being lived here, where living lamps are burning. At the beginning of this night, that will happen right through the night. There is this beacon of light, awake, burning, consoling, and indeed holding up the world in the hours when things go wrong. Indeed, it is something to be borne in mind that the night is the moment of encounter. The Lord gave the example when he chose, even in the midst of his apostolic journeys, to go apart and to spend nights on the mountain or to get up. And there is a stillness in the air when there is no light, because even the birds do not sing, and the whole of nature is, as it were, waiting, a stillness. And that is something that we need to recuperate, for in this society in which we live, the danger is that we adjust to the timetable that is out there, and that means losing the privilege of the intimacy of the night. We forget that with artificial light we don't see the true pattern of time, because night is as clear as the day in our cities. And is one big difference when I go back to Ireland, that actually one does see the night sky far more than in somewhere like Rome, because one has no artificial light for great expanses of Ireland. It's still a green country, and therefore one sees the difference between day and night. But in our cities and in our life, especially if one obliterates the intimacy of the stillness of night with a machine, a noise-producing machine, a light-producing machine, notably the television or the screen of the internet, then one is eating on that intimacy of the night. And believe you me, it has changed hugely the nature of not only the life of a priest out there, but also of monastic life itself. One is very, very much tempted to sacrifice the night to something more interesting than pure emptiness. And just as it happens, recently I was listening to a holy priest giving a lecture, a warning to priests about this question of not taking care of their soul, because precisely they were not taking care of the night. what happens is that now priests are, like anyone else, very much involved in high tech, and therefore they go into, first of all, something which I suppose for some priests would have to be done, some operation on the computer, but then they're on it. And then from one operation to the next, they stay on it, and they do not realize that they're actually using quite long chunks of time in things which are, for the soul, not particularly useful, and even pastorally not particularly useful. So when it comes then to what the point he was making was this, the examination of conscience at night, they have a quick mental flick over the day, and then go into compline. Whereas actually one needs to take care of the soul as one does of the body. And this question of the stillness that the soul needs to work on itself is not without importance. We are damaged human beings. So in that sense, we remember where we're coming from. And these ladies who, over the Middle Ages, were there as living lamps, just keeping company to the Lord, as they're doing here now in the night, is a reminder of that nature of the earthly angel who is just there to glorify the King. And God has no need to justify his calling. He is completely free to call also an earthly court of adorers, as he is free to call members out of humanity to serve him in the priesthood. And there is no priest who is not also called ipso facto to be a contemplative. One can't be a functionary, one has to be a friend of the heart of the Saviour. Otherwise one is not in relationship but in function. And we have not to do so much with a religion as a relationship, and that is perceived also by the people. And after a while, many priests who start off actually quite well, when they leave the seminary, they do get into this frenetic mode where they have much to do, and unfortunately they're not favoured by the pastoral situation in many countries. The very shortage of priests means that they're doing the work of about 10 priests formally, and therefore, if they're not careful, they will not do this bit of safeguarding the well-being of their soul. And it happens, and then they're easy prey for the tempter. And also they have less to give because they're eaten at both ends. And what happens is they regurgitate and recycle what is already in their system once acquired. And the people perceive it full well. So, we have here, the lamp of God had not yet gone out, and Samuel was lying in the sanctuary of the Lord, where the ark of God was. And here we have a prefiguration of what is, by now, the fullness. If this care was taken to preserve and protect the presence as it was then felt to be in the temple of the Lord, what more should we do with regard to protecting that? Because when we come into the presence, we are doing far more even than Moses, who was called apart and told to take off his sandals, because we are actually in holy ground, in extraterritorial territory, which belongs not to earth, but as Vatican territory belongs to the Vatican, even in the heart of Rome, so too a church is the property of God and his angels. We can't see them normally, but they are there. Therefore we protect it. I happened to come across a true story which happened in, may have been Ireland, may not have been Ireland, doesn't really matter, but I heard about it in Ireland. It was something which is quite surprising, and it's quite true. There's no way it wasn't true, because the point is that the priest himself was very puzzled about it, and he had the shock of his life when it happened. He was tidying up the church, closed it, and then forgot sometime later in the night that he hadn't done something which he should have done before closing everything up. So he went back in the night to the church, opened up from the sacristy side. The church was full of people. Who let you in? No answer. Who let you in? No answer. So a third time he insisted, and there was no answer, and I didn't even register his voice, his question. So he went out, puzzled to the core. Eventually he came back, opened the door again, expecting to see them all. Not a soul nothing in sight. He went back with himself, tried to get some sleep, and went the following morning to a priest friend of his to explain what had happened. My friend, it's not that complicated. It's probably like this. Have you heard of the holy souls? Well, I would suggest that what was happening is that these were holy souls doing a bit of their purgatory there, where they had been very naughty. They had been talking in church, they had been irrespectful of the Blessed Sacrament, and therefore they were not able to talk when it was the turn to talk, and they were doing nothing but gazing at what they should have been adoring. Now do you get the message? That's probably a sin which even we, if we're not careful, will fall into very easily, because we become familiar with the sacred things, forgetting what we were told at ordination: imitate what you are handling. It is something greater than ourselves. And indeed, I remember when, at the age of 13, we were in Spain. I was at that time still Protestant, being exposed really at that period for the first time to things Catholic in a big way. And I was, one Sunday morning, I went into a Catholic church, and I was hit very strongly by something which for them was quite normal, but which for me got the message through. It was when there were two priests, I think, involved. It was in 1968, thereabouts. And they were going into the tabernacle, and I knew enough about Catholicism to know what that meant, and I noticed, oh, that's interesting. When they open that door, they kneel to suggest that they're going lower than what is above them. And that very gesture hit me as something which, of course, they would take for granted, but which for me was very interesting. That there, the creature is smaller than what appears to be just a bit of matter. But the whole gestuality was actually very eloquent. And we need to think about these gestures, because if we're not careful, even they can be sacrificed to a functionality. And each one, if it's expressive, is a genuine moment of reparation and adoration. And there's a world of difference between an automated robot-type genuflection and something done with the heart. The latter consoles, there where the Lord is much offended in church. A wobble, a simple nod, does not console. And we can fall into that because we're often exposed to the sacred mysteries. And even in the celebration itself, we can be too quick about our gestures. The big advantage of the liturgical renewal is that the number of genuflections and signs of the cross has been greatly reduced, because the tendency, if one has them all, as they were before, is to do them quite quickly. Whereas now there are only 3 genuflections in the whole celebration. Well, they've got one at the very beginning, one at the very end before we start, but during the course of the celebration itself, we've only got 3, so they can be done well. And so the sign of the cross. It's important that we get our gestures right, and also that we mean everything we say. The other story is about the Blessed Sacrament, and it happened fairly recently in Ireland. We're in the month of November, so it's something which we can perhaps take with us. I happened, not that long ago, to be listening to a friend of mine who has a friend, and she'd be slightly older than we would be, I suppose, but not much. She was a woman of prayer, and she had been in the cathedral, actually the cathedral of our diocese, praying, and she hadn't realised that they were locking up the church. It's a big cathedral, so there she was hidden in some angle of the cathedral, and oof, they locked the church, and I'm inside. So she had to kind of make the best of it and try and nod off in church until they opened the church the following morning. So she found some kind of cushion in a confession box and tried to get to sleep. I think she actually went to sleep in the confession box itself because it was got darker in there. So there she was. But then, about midnight, she was woken up by something which was a bit strange. There seems to be something going on in there. So she peeped out of the confession box. She couldn't believe her eyes. She looked up at the high altar, and it was all happening. There were a number of clerics there, vested. There was a whole team, And they were celebrating the solemn Mass, it would seem, at the high altar. But there was something missing. Their feet were not touching the ground. Wow! So, as best she could, she tried to get some sleep even with that crowd around. And as soon as it was dawn, when they opened up, she shot out of church and didn't know what to make of it at all. But then eventually she copped on. What was probably happening was that they precisely were doing their purgatory for the irreverent, casual, whatever it was, celebrations that way back when they were there, they didn't do properly. So it's happened too in the case of Padre Pio. He saw one day a novice cleaning away the candlesticks of the high altar, even though he was long dead. And apparently what he was doing, he was making up for the negligence that he'd shown towards the duties as sacristan he had when he was a young Franciscan. So these things are on our copybook. The way that we handle our God directly are things which concern us specifically, because we know that a priest will be judged very severely on the way he handles his God. He is bigger than us and not vice versa. So, this then is what we're at every time we come into the sacred presence. And indeed, the very fact that we enter that sacred presence is not indifferent either. The ancient act of taking holy water is also something which has roots already in the Old Testament, because this notion of coming into a zone apart and purifying ourselves for that is not indifferent. And St. Bernard of Clairvaux, who had all kinds of problems on his shoulders, he was both abbot and also a great preacher, and he was involved in politics and so on because of the Crusades. He had many problems in his head, and all these foundations they were making all over the place. He had a lot going in his tiny mental computer, but every time he came from the cloister to the church, when he took the holy water, he would say to his problems, "Restez ici, remain here, je vous reprendrai en sortant. I will take you up again as I come out." And he also is known to have done very seriously everything he did with regard to prayer. He had this relationship precisely, a great relationship, for instance, with Our Blessed Lady. All these texts that we have from him show that he was somebody very much bonded to Our Blessed Lady as a son to his mother. And he would greet her, "Ave Maria." And one day he was passing a statue and just said to the statue, "Ave Maria." And the statue answered, "Ave Mirande." And it's there, the reproduction of that scene in a statue in Rome, in Tre Fontane, where the head of St. Paul fell. 3 fountains there. It was reopened as a Trappist monastery from La Trappe, actually, in France. And they're still there. And there's that statue there showing that scene there where Our Blessed Lady responded. So they listen to these greetings in heaven. It all depends on the intensity with which it's done. It's kind of important that we don't treat statues, and especially the presence itself, just in an objective way without relationship. There's a world of difference, even on the human level, between a cold hug and a warm hug, and a word which is not meant and a word which really is meant. So, what happens? This word comes, Samuel. Of course, that means you've got the root of Shemach and El. The Lord listens. He listened to Anna's prayer. But here, it's all based on this listening, but the other way around this time. And you know, the consequence, it happens 3 times because he goes to Eli thinking that he's calling. And of course, Eli realizes it's the Lord who's calling. And this word that he tells him to say is something that we can take with us on this vigil of our moment apart. We too just ask for that. Speak, Lord, your servant is listening. And that is something which will happen if we want it to happen. As when we come into an encounter with a human being, if we want to learn more, we will. If we know it all, we will not learn any more. It's exactly the same with the Lord. If we don't give him space, if we talk at him or fill the time, even sometimes with holy things like reading without a stop, then we will lose the direct line. We need books, we need words, but we need to address the Lord first so that he speaks through them, and not crowd out the Lord directly through the indirect means. So we'll just take that with us this night, that if the Lord is given a chance, he will give a word to us, because he knows exactly what we need to hear. And it applies also when we're handling people, if we're preaching to them. He knows what each one in front of us needs to hear. And it's important before we open our mouth to ask for a word through us, that the word will come to us and minister to each one there. And that will actually happen. You know, the Lord does apply a word, especially to thirsting souls out there. And on a Sunday morning, you've got people who want a word. You've got people who are hungry for a word, and they're grateful for a word. They want consolation and nourishment. So let's give them the Lord's word. So for that to happen, first of all, we receive it. It's important to pray over the readings before one preaches on them. So that one asks the Lord, Lord, give me the word from this word for your people, and use me as your voice box.